Hiya. In the long, long ago, when I was a kid, I used to read a comic called The Tiger, and my favourite story was a story about Billy Keane. The comic strip was called Billy's Boots, and Billy Keane uh, found these old pair of very old-fashioned football boots that he had to wear because he couldn't afford the newer model. And these boots had this magical quality. When he put them on, he played brilliantly. When he didn't wear them, he was awful. And I wanted to start this talk because with that story because I think it raises for some of us this idea that progress in sport will be largely dependent on some outside source, some external inspiration, some ingredient that lies outside of ourselves. And while structure and infrastructure and great coaching and good facilities all play their part, I want tonight to talk more about what lies inside you. So you'll see in the second slide a reference to the mental skills program that I devised in consultation with Aidan O'Rourke and Carl Oakes at Queen's Sport a few years ago, and together we came up with this acronym A.I.M, A.I.M, and the A is for attitude, and that is what I want to concentrate on tonight. So the next slide offers you a definition. And in this slide, attitude is defined as a set of feelings or beliefs that you have or hold towards someone or something. You think in sport of maybe your favourite grounds or grounds that you don't like playing in, or your disposition towards certain types of weather, or matchups against opponents who you think will be harder or easier. You think about what it's like to go out training on weather that's really inclement, or turning up for the first day of training after a bad result or a bad performance by you, or the process you go through inside yourself when you get a big setback like an injury or some other disappointment. The feelings and beliefs that you have towards someone or something. And of course, when I say someone, that someone could be yourself, not just other people. I was listening recently to it's a really great podcast called 13 Seconds to the Moon, and it charts the story of the Apollo missions. And I learned that they used the word attitude to describe the position of the Apollo spaceships in relation to their destination. So they would then maneuver the ship so it would have what they would call the right attitude, that it would be pointing in the right direction. And I really like that colloquial idea to get us to think about the direction of travel that we have as sportsmen and women. What is our attitude? How do we know that we are pointing ourselves in the right direction? Now, this model is a fancy phrase, I think, is to call it a triadic model, 3 components to it. And the components in this model of attitude include your thinking or cognition, your knowledge and your beliefs. Then there's your feelings, your emotions, the affective side of attitude, the emotional responses to what you do. And then, of course, there's the behavior itself. Behavior is always above the surface. It's what's most observable. It's what other people see you doing. It's what forms patterns in your day and in your week and across your seasons. And these 3 components, what you think, how you feel, and what you actually do, are the kind of the holy trinity of attitude. And there's I think a sort of dance that's always going on between them. What I would suggest to you is that they form a narrative, the story that you tell yourself about who you are, about where you've been, and about where you're going. I think it's important that you understand how you make meaning out of all the endeavour that goes into your sport. I think we're meaning-making creatures. You can make meaning, and of course you could make excuses, or you can work out how to figure something out so you can make progress, or you can decide to quit, give up. So I'm wondering, do you have a good story about yourself? Are you pointing in the right direction? Because I believe that what you are telling yourself about who you are and what you're doing really matters. I'm going to tell you a story now about another athlete, and I'm going to go back to the sport that I started in. It was my first love in sport was middle distance running. Now this guy predates my career, my time in the sport. And this is a picture of an Australian called John Landy, one of the great figures of middle distance running in the last century. Certainly a very significant figure in the 1950s. He was a really tough guy. He was exceptionally talented. And one of the things that I wanted to let you know about was that Landy was one of the top milers in the world. He really started to break through around 1950 and dominated that distance for the next few years globally. And athletics was a huge sport with big audiences all over the world. And in the 12 months between January 1953 and January 1954, Landy ran the mile competitively 9 times, and he ran between 4:2 and 4:12. So he was consistent. In fact, in January 1954, he ran 4 minutes and 2 seconds twice. Now, the big target, the mythical goal in athletics, was the idea that someone could run underneath 4 minutes for a mile. That was elusive, and it was highly prized. It was seen as an athletic Everest. In fact, I think Everest was climbed for the first time around the same time that the 4 minute mile was actually broken, and we'll come to that in a second. So there's Landy. He's knocking his pan in. He's traveling around the world racing, chasing this amazing record and not quite making it. In fact, I think the first race he did in early January 53, he went through the 3-lap mark, 1 lap to go, the bell sounds, and he is just under 3 minutes. He is dead on record pace. And then fades slightly to run the 4:2. So many of you will know what it's like to chase goals and to maybe sometimes come up short, to feel frustrated. And this is, you see how this sits with you. This is what Landy said after the second race. He said, "Firstly, I believe the 4 minute mile is beyond my capabilities. 2 seconds may not seem much, but to me it's like trying to break through a brick wall. Someone might achieve the 4 minute mile that the world is waiting for desperately, but I don't think I can." That's a narrative. And that's the shaping of an attitude that's come out of all that disappointment. So I want you to have a watch now at a short film made on the 6th of May 1954, barely 5 months after that interview that Landy gave. And let's see what happens.
25-year-old Roger Bannister, third from the left, gets away at the Iffley Ground, Oxford, for the race of his life. For years, he has dreamed of becoming the first man to run the mile in less than 4 minutes, and now, with Chris Brasher setting the pace in front, he's decided that this is the right moment. Bannister's old friend and rival, Chris Chataway, is in third place, waiting his time to take over as pacer. After 2.5 laps, Brasher gives way to Chataway. Bannister, a superb tactician, has suffered some criticism in the past for adopting his own rather unorthodox training methods, but they're paying dividends now. Despite the slight wind, he's clocking great time. Any moment now, and we'll see the famous Bannister burst. And here he comes. Bannister goes streaking forward with about 250 yards to the tapes. Just look at his action as his long legs carry him nearer that world record. And Bannister has done it. Though he's out on his feet, his coach and team manager tell him he's achieved his ambition. The mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. A magnificent win for Great Britain. Bannister, a medical student, has clipped Gunderhaug's record by 2 seconds. With disarming modesty, he has this to say about his triumph.
Well, all I can say is that I'm absolutely overwhelmed and delighted. It was a great surprise to me to be able to do it today. And I think I was very lucky.
So the outcome of the race was a new world record and the first sub 4 minute mile in history. 3:59.4, Roger Bannister. So I wonder what was going on with Bannister that made what seemed to be impossible possible. Landy, as you'll find out, was as gifted an athlete with as many physical attributes. So perhaps we might think about the part that attitude may have played. There are other things in the story, of course. There was a brilliant planning of the race and this incredible pacing by, first of all, Chris Brasher and then by Christopher Chataway, who towed Bannister round the last lap until the final bend when Bannister broke away. An incredible act of teamwork and selflessness by the other two, and a great piece of planning. But what about the attitude or mindset that Bannister had? So I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I want you to listen to someone else who I've enjoyed reading about and listened to speak over the years. This is a guy called Jim Lohr. He was a professional tennis coach, and then went into organizational development work. And this is Lohr talking about the inner game, about what you say to yourself and how it affects performance. So let's see what you make of this.
How helpful is that private voice? Is it a voice you would be proud to have displayed on a wall, particularly during tough times? How does it speak to you? Is it really a coach that is really giving you very strong, positive messages that help you, or is it actually working to break you down, to actually cause you more grief, more pain, more stress? And once you begin to realize that voice is almost always saying something, and then to begin to take more responsibility for how that voice is actually speaking to you, and to realize that this voice will be the only voice that's with you until your death. We want that voice to be someone who is a contributor to your life.
So that was Jim Lohr speaking. Lohr is a former tennis professional and a management consultant now by trade. How does your voice speak to you? How does it help you, or does your own inner voice more often break you down and hold you back. It is always saying something. I wonder what Bannister's inner voice was on the day of his record. Here's a picture of him after the race. You think about the attitude or mindset that he had in order to get himself to that state of complete exhaustion, to go and do something that no human being on record had ever done before, the first sub 4 minute mile. And I like this phrase that he was competing to win, this idea that he had, and you can develop an attitude that you will go as far as you can with everything you've got. Maybe sometimes your own inner voice, your own attitude is to be safe, to not make mistakes, to be tidy, to not stand out, to not take risks, to play safe rather than compete to win. Here's a lovely photograph of the Bannister in the middle, sometime later with his two mates, Brasher on the left with the spectacles and Chataway on the right. Just an incredible piece of selfless teamwork as well. Now this next picture, have a close look at it. This is the Olympic Games of 1952 in Helsinki. So you see the gold medal winner. It's actually an athlete from Luxembourg, believe it or not, in the 1500. And on his left is the American, and on the right, just almost out of picture, is the athlete from Germany who picked up the bronze. Probably coming fourth in the Olympics. I'm guessing, it's just one of the hardest things to have to deal with. If you look closely at the picture, you'll see trailing in fourth is Roger Bannister himself. And he was on record as saying after that race that he thought seriously about quitting because he had been going for a medal, going for gold. And when that didn't work out, he then worked through all that uncertainty and decided to have another go at the sport and to focus on the 4 minute mile as his target. So this is also a story about adversity. This is also a story about how he thought and felt, allowed him to point himself in a new direction, to adjust his attitude to the circumstances and disappointment of coming fourth in Olympic Games and to go again. So I'm wondering, and here's a question for all of us. Are we looking at a challenge and saying that it's a challenge beyond my capabilities? Maybe you think that someone might achieve that goal, but maybe it's not me. Sort of John Landy script around January 1954. Let me turn the story around slightly. This is a picture of a former ocean liner, luxury liner, called the Arandora Star. It was converted to become a troop carrier in the Second World War. It left Liverpool in July 1940, carrying prisoners, people who were interned. I was going to call them prisoners of war. They're actually mainly Italians, Austrians and Germans who had been living in Great Britain. And when the war broke out, they were identified as being hostile aliens. So they were interned, and almost 1,000 of them were placed on this ship and were being sent to an internment camp in Canada. So the ship left Liverpool, I think, on July the 2nd, 1940. And about 140 miles northwest of the coast of Donegal, it was hit by a torpedo from a German submarine, and it sank. One of the survivors was this guy, Sergeant Norman Price. He said, I could see hundreds of men hanging on to the ship like ants, And then the ship went up, and one end slid rapidly down, taking men with her. Many had broken their necks jumping or diving into the water, and others hurt themselves, landing on wreckage and debris. Over half of those on board drowned that night. And I want you to imagine for a moment what that must have been like and what it was like to fight for survival. And here's one man who was on the boat, and you saw he was in a picture featured earlier. I don't know if you recognize him. Here's another clue. He was standing just to Bannister's side when he crossed the line and was one of the men pictured holding him up. This is a guy called Franz Stampfel. And Stampfel had become Bannister's coach. He was on the ship that night and was actually below decks when the torpedo hit and kicked out a panel, an iron panel, to break out, and then swam and floated in the Atlantic for over 8 hours until he got picked up. Quite a horrifying and traumatic story. Stampfel actually then was brought back to England and then was sent on another ship to Australia, where he was in a prisoner of war camp for all of the Second World War. He'd actually arrived in London in 1937. He fled Austria because he recognised the threat that Hitler's rise was posing to his own freedom and safety. And when he got to London, he was asked if he could do any useful work, and he said he could coach a bit of sport. And actually, Harold Abrahams, who's if you've seen Chariots of Fire, was the gold medal sprinter who featured in Chariots of Fire. Harold Abrahams helped him get a job in Belfast, of all places, where he came to coach athletics. Then he went back to London in 1939. The war breaks out, he gets interned, and then this odyssey begins with that frightful night in July, where he ended up in the Atlantic Ocean in the dark for hours and hours and hours, with many people around him dead or dying. So he goes to Australia. He says something really interesting about how he framed his time in Australia. He said that when he got into the camp in Australia, he became a sports coach and he coached multi-sports. And he said, I need to do it for my sanity and to bring meaning into my own life and the life of others in the camp. Now that is an expression of personal attitude, of fortitude, and of resilience. So he comes back to England and he ends up coaching Bannister, Chataway and Brasher. And Chataway said that without his coaching, they couldn't have achieved that 4-minute mile effort. Stampfel was famous because he's seen as being the author of interval training, which many of you will now do in your sports preparation across a whole range of sports that we play at Queen's. But Chataway said something else. He said, more than that, he brought magic into our group. He brought magic into our group. He affected the way that they thought. On the day of the actual 4-minute mile, the weather became inclement. It got cloudy, it got wet, and it got a bit windy. The worst thing for a distance running world record attempt. And about an hour before the race, Bannister got some anxiety, and he went to Stampfel, his coach, and said, I think we should maybe postpone this effort. And Stampfel said to him, Roger, if you do that, you will regret it for the rest of your life. I believe you can run 3:56. 3:56. And I'm thinking, this coach is talking to this nervous, talented young man just ahead of this attempt about some wind and rain. This is a man who clung for his life onto some wreckage in the Atlantic for 8 hours in the dark, 150 miles from land. In looking at your own challenges, therefore, it's important that you understand how you speak to yourself. That idea of the voice that Laura talked about, that it has to be a persuasive voice. It's good to have encouragement and support from others, but you also need to pay attention to what you are saying to yourself. That matters more than anything else, I would suggest. Your attitude is what you think, what you say to yourself, the sort of feelings you foster, and then what you do. Your attitude is about the meaning and value that something has, your big goal, and the plans you put in place to achieve it, and then the steps you take day by day to execute those plans. But that is driven by your attitude. That is driven by what is inside you, about how you talk to yourself and the feelings that you foster. So I'm going to bring the presentation to a close now, and I want to do that by going back to the image of John Landy that was at the start of the presentation. So John, in 1954, in January 54, was saying, this target's a brick wall, I can't do it. And then 48 days after Bannister's record, on June 21st, 1954, Landy went to Finland and ran a mile from the front without pacemakers. And you remember that in the film of Bannister, you saw how structured that attempt was and how much help he got. Landy goes on his own, gun to tape, and runs 3:57.9, a new world record. Just a few weeks after Bannister's. So what had changed? Because clearly Landy hadn't suddenly transformed his fitness. He wasn't running in home turf and he had no pacemakers. So some change in mindset had occurred. What's your Everest? What's your 4-minute mile? What's your big dream? And at the moment, I suppose a lot of us have got a little bit more time in our hands to stop and think about where we're at and where we'd like to go beyond the current emergency that we're living through. What's your big dream in sport? And why is that important? What gives it meaning? Because understanding that is part of a story that you need to construct for yourself. Then what's your plan? What does that plan look like now, this week and next week and the week after? Because that is where it starts. Remember, behavior is a reflection of what you think. And when something has meaning, you have strong feeling about it that motivates and drives you and keeps you going whenever the going gets tough. At the moment, I know that EAP athletes are filling out weekly schedules showing the balance between academic work and their training work. That's challenging right now. I dare say you're having to look at using your back garden or the garage or a floor in the house or a country road in an imaginative way where you can go out and, first of all, keep up your physical conditioning. And then there's how do you apply yourself to a skill set in less than ordinary circumstances. Look, I believe, and I believe that you believe, that you can do something every day. That you can do something every day. Your own persuasive effort towards yourself is really at the heart of this. Like the Apollo spaceship, get yourself pointed in the right direction to serve your mission. Get going from where you are now, today, and then tomorrow, and the day after. And you're not alone. You're not the only one. Keep going, and thank you for listening.